At the age of 67, Khed Alami's life took an unexpected turn when doctors diagnosed him with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. A man of deep faith and unwavering devotion to his Islamic beliefs, Khed initially met the diagnosis with calm acceptance. As an Imam, he had spent his life guiding others in the ways of Allah, finding solace and strength in the teachings of the Quran. This illness, though devastating, felt to him like a test to trial, just as Allah had tested the patience and devotion of the prophets before him. He reflected often on the story of Prophet Ibrahim, who was commanded by Allah to sacrifice his son. Khed believed that every hardship in life, no matter how painful, was a test from Allah, a chance to prove his faith and devotion. Despite the physical toll of his chemotherapy sessions, Khed never wavered in his belief. The treatments left him exhausted, his body frail, but his spirit remained resolute. Each session was a trial, but each was also an opportunity to draw closer to Allah. As the chemicals flowed through his veins, Khed would close his eyes and whisper prayers under his breath. At night, when the pain became unbearable and sleep was elusive, he would lie awake in bed, repeating his words of devotion. "If I die tonight, O Allah, let me meet you," he would pray, trusting that if his time had come, his Lord would accept him. Khed's faith was his anchor during this time. Even as the days passed and his condition grew worse, he found comfort in his prayers. His friends and family often visited him, offering their support, but Khed remained focused on his relationship with Allah. For him, it was not the fear of death that gripped him, but the hope that his end would be peaceful and that he would meet Allah with a heart full of devotion. He had lived his life in service to his faith, and now, as death seemed imminent, he saw this illness not as a punishment, but as a chance to prove the depth of his belief. He believed that Allah would answer his prayers, just as he had answered the prayers of the faithful throughout history. But Khed could never have imagined how Allah would answer, or the profound journey that lay ahead. One day, after returning home from yet another exhausting chemotherapy session, Khed Alami began to feel a strange tightness in his chest. At first, he thought it was just a cramp, something that would pass with a little rest. But as the pain intensified and his breathing became labored, he realized that this was more serious than he had anticipated. His chest felt as though a heavy weight had been placed upon it, and every breath became more difficult. Panic crept into his heart as he struggled to take in air, his thoughts scattering in every direction. Before he could even process the situation fully, he noticed the chaotic flurry of activity around him. Nurses and doctors rushed into the room, their voices raised in urgency, but Khed felt detached, as if he were watching it all unfold from a distance. He couldn't understand why he wasn't able to speak or move. He tried to call out, to tell them that he was still here, but no words escaped his lips. His body felt as if it were no longer his own. It was then that the terrifying truth hit him: he was no longer alive. Khed's consciousness seemed to separate from his physical body, floating above it, as if he were an observer in his own life. He could see his lifeless form on the bed below, surrounded by frantic medical staff performing CPR. The dissonance of it all overwhelmed him. How could he be conscious if his heart had stopped? Was this death, or was this merely the beginning of something else? As he drifted, Khed was drawn toward a soft light in the distance. It was a brilliant, warm glow that seemed to beckon him, promising peace and comfort. He moved toward it, feeling an inexplicable sense of calm wash over him as he neared the light. The sounds around him shifted, blending into familiar murmurs, memories from his childhood. He heard his mother singing lullabies, his father reciting prayers before the evening adhan, the very sounds that had once filled his home with warmth and love. The verses from the Quran, too, seemed to echo through the air, but they felt distant, as if being recited by someone he couldn't quite place. It felt as though his entire life, every moment, was converging into this one singular point in time. Khed's heart swelled with emotion as he recognized the peace that enveloped him. For a brief moment, he was certain that he had entered paradise. His soul was filled with an overwhelming sense of joy and tranquility. Tears streamed down his face, but they were not tears of sorrow. Instead, they were tears of profound relief and gratitude. He had finally reached the presence of Allah, the eternal peace he had longed for. But just as quickly as the peace had come, it was replaced by an unsettling shift. The lush greenery around him began to wither, and the branches of the trees turned black. The fresh fruit hanging from their limbs shriveled and fell to the ground, rotting instantly. The air became thick with the smell of decay, and the once serene environment turned dark and oppressive. Khed's joy dissolved into fear as he witnessed the change. The light that had once been so comforting was now dimming, replaced by an eerie darkness. Screams filled the air, anguished cries of pain, suffering, and torment. It was a sound unlike anything he had ever heard, the collective agony of souls in torment. Amid the chorus of suffering, one voice rose above the rest. It was a woman's voice, and it was unmistakably familiar, his mother's. Have mercy, she cried, her voice laced with desperation. Khed's heart clenched in his chest as the agony of her words reached into his soul. The world around him began to disintegrate, the darkness smothering him on all sides. There was no light, no way to escape. Only a vast, empty void. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. He was trapped in a suffocating stillness, lost in the vast expanse of darkness. And yet, through it all, there was a voice. A deep, resonant voice that vibrated in his very being. Khed, everything will now be revealed, the voice said, sending a shiver through him. He understood instinctively that this was not a mere hallucination. This was something far more profound, something that transcended the physical realm. And in that moment, Khed realized he was in hell. This was the place Allah had warned humanity about, and he was standing at its threshold. But why was he here? He was an Imam, a servant of Allah. He had dedicated his life to spreading the teachings of the Quran, to guiding others on the righteous path. He couldn't understand why he was here, in this place of darkness and despair. There was no answer, only the echoing silence that surrounded him. As Khed's senses reeled in the thick, suffocating darkness of what he had come to recognize as hell, his mind struggled to make sense of the overwhelming chaos. The darkness was unlike any he had ever known. It wasn't merely the absence of light, but an all-consuming void, a complete absence of meaning. The cold air seemed to press against him from all directions, smothering him, trapping him in a place that felt utterly devoid of hope. The agonizing cries of those suffering in the distance mingled with the echoes of despair, reverberating through his very soul. Amidst this torment, one voice stood out. It was his mother's voice, desperate and pleading, "Have mercy, have mercy." Her words cut through the suffocating silence like a dagger, striking at the very core of Khed's being. He wanted to reach her, to offer comfort, to somehow stop the pain, but he was powerless in this dark abyss. The air grew colder, and Khed felt the very weight of eternity pressing down on him. He could hear the distant sound of chains clinking, the unmistakable sound of souls bound and punished. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to make sense of what was happening. But then, from somewhere within the darkness, a sudden shift occurred. There, in the center of the void, a bright light began to pierce through the suffocating gloom. At first it was faint, just a glimmer on the horizon, but it grew stronger with each passing moment. He couldn't help but be drawn toward it, a powerful force pulling him toward it, promising salvation, relief from the torment that surrounded him. As Khed moved closer, the air began to shift. The oppressive cold began to recede, replaced by a warmth that radiated from the light. Slowly he emerged from the darkness, and what he saw made his heart race in disbelief. Before him lay a garden, more beautiful than anything he could have ever imagined. The lush trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches laden with fruit of every kind, and rivers of crystal clear water flowed freely, sparkling in the bright light that bathed the scene. The fragrance of flowers filled the air, sweet and intoxicating. This was paradise. There was no doubt in his mind. He had crossed into the realm of the blessed, the realm promised to those who had followed the path of righteousness. But as he stood there, soaking in the beauty and peace of this place, something shifted once again. The light dimmed, the colors faded, and the air turned thick and heavy. The once immaculate trees began to wither, their branches stiffening, their fruit shriveling and falling to the ground. The once pure waters of the river became murky, and the gentle breeze that had carried the sweet fragrance of flowers turned into a harsh, biting wind. The lush garden around him began to rot before his very eyes, the once vibrant life now decaying into a sickening mass of blackened branches and foul-smelling fruit. A chill ran down Khed's spine as the scene before him darkened into a grotesque version of what had once been paradise. In an instant, the sounds of torment and suffering returned, now amplified, as if the entire garden had become a place of punishment. The voice of his mother, desperate and anguished, screamed out again, "Have mercy! Have mercy, her cry echoed through the fading garden, the sound reverberating in Khed's ears like a warning. Khed felt himself pulled from the beauty of the vision of paradise and thrust back into the hellish void he had escaped from. The darkness once again surrounded him, pressing in on him from all sides. He could feel the weight of it, the pain, the suffering of the souls trapped in eternal agony. It was a place without reprieve, without hope. He began to understand the full scope of what he was witnessing, the paradox of paradise and hell existing side by side. One moment, the most beautiful, serene place imaginable, filled with peace and eternal comfort. The next, a nightmarish landscape full of suffering and despair. It was then that Khed understood. This was not just a vision of two separate realms, it was a vision of the choices he had made in his life, the journey of every soul. The fleeting beauty of paradise could not be taken for granted. It was a fleeting moment, a place to be earned, not a guarantee. And hell was the consequence of those who failed to seek the truth, those who had turned their back on righteousness and faith. In that moment, as the darkness once again enveloped him, Khed knew that he had not yet seen the end of his journey. The path ahead was uncertain, but the vision of paradise and hell would remain in his heart forever, a reminder of the choices that lay before him in the realm of the living. As Khed stood in the midst of the suffocating darkness, the overwhelming weight of his surroundings seemed to crush his spirit. His heart beat erratically in his chest as his mind struggled to comprehend the inexplicable visions unfolding around him. In this place of torment, where the cries of suffering souls reverberated through the air, Khed felt lost, as if trapped in a nightmare with no escape. It was then that his gaze fell upon the throne ahead. It was tall, imposing, yet strangely familiar. The figure seated upon it seemed almost divine, yet in the unnatural stillness of the scene, something felt profoundly wrong. The figure on the throne was bound. His hands and feet were shackled in heavy iron chains, his posture hunched under the weight of sorrow. His eyes, filled with sadness and a deep, unfathomable sorrow, locked onto Khed's in an intense gaze that struck him to his core. Khed's knees buckled under the sight, and a wave of disbelief surged through him. No, this couldn't be. This had to be a mistake. The man sitting before him, bound and helpless, was none other than the Prophet Muhammad, the very person Khed had revered and spoken of with the utmost respect throughout his life. For a moment, Khed's mind could not process the sight. The Prophet was not supposed to be here. This was a place for the damned, a place for those who had strayed from the path of righteousness, not for the most revered figure in Islam. The question echoed in Khed's mind, why was he here? His hands were bound in chains, his expression filled with pain and regret. It was an image so foreign, so unsettling, that Khed's heart seemed to shatter with confusion. He dropped to his knees, his body trembling with emotion, his lips unable to form coherent words. His faith, built on years of sermons and teachings, began to crumble before him. The sight of the Prophet, bound in chains, filled Khed with an unbearable sorrow. This was not the man of divine strength and wisdom he had always known. This was someone in anguish, someone whose burden weighed heavy with unimaginable grief. Why was he here, in this place of suffering? Khed wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, but his voice caught in his throat. Just then, a deep, resonant voice echoed around the throne, filling the dark void. It was as if the very fabric of the universe trembled with the sound of the words. "Khed, everything will now be revealed," the voice intoned. Khed's body shook with fear and anticipation. He knew this voice, this was the voice of Allah. But why was it speaking in such a place, and why was it speaking to him? Before Khed could gather his thoughts, the world around him seemed to shift. A book appeared, falling from the heavens above, a dust cloud billowing around it as it landed before Khed. The book was unmistakable, it was the Quran. But why was it here, in this place? As the pages slowly turned on their own, Khed's eyes widened. This was a sign, he thought. This was the answer he had been waiting for. But as the pages continued to turn, the words and images etched into them began to reveal something unsettling. A vision emerged from the Quran, showing the Kaaba, but not the Kaaba Khed had always known. It was surrounded by idols, each one representing a different god. The voice echoed once again, "Do you recognize them, Khed?" Images of the gods of the age of ignorance appeared in his mind, gods worshipped before the arrival of Islam. This is the Kaaba before Islam. Where was Allah then? Khed, the question shook him to his core. Where was Allah? Khed had never asked himself that question before, but now it gnawed at his mind. He had always assumed Allah was above all other gods. But what was this place? Suddenly, the scene shifted again. Khed saw another image this time, an altar surrounded by people making sacrifices. The people were Canaanites, known for their idol worship, and Khed recognized the idol they were bowing to. His heart stopped. It was Baal, a name he had heard only in history books. The idol's inscription was eerily familiar, resembling the ancient script used to refer to God in Hebrew texts. The voice thundered once again, "Do you see, Khed? This is the same Allah they worshipped, even before Islam." Khed was trembling now, a whirlwind of confusion and doubt raging in his mind. The world around him, once a place of absolute certainty, now seemed uncertain and blurred. He had always believed in Allah, in the Quran, in the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. But now, faced with this terrifying vision of the past, Khed felt as though everything he had known was unraveling. As his mind spun, he heard the deep, powerful voice of Allah once again. Have you ever questioned who Allah truly is? Khed, the question pierced his soul, and Khed was left speechless. In that moment, the world seemed to fall apart. Khed stood in the suffocating silence, his heart racing and his mind tangled in a web of confusion. The question that had been posed to him, the question that had echoed through his soul, "Have you ever questioned who Allah truly is?" resonated in his chest like a thunderclap. He had never thought about it before. He had never needed to. Allah was always the center of his faith, the unquestionable creator, the one who gave life and took it away. But now, in this strange, dark place, where visions of ancient idols and forgotten gods swirled around him, he could no longer hold onto the certainties he had built his life upon. The voice, deep, resonant, and seemingly eternal, continued to reverberate in the vast, empty space. How do you know who Allah truly is? Khed, the question felt like an insurmountable weight on his chest. He wanted to scream, to cry out in defiance, but the words caught in his throat. How could he doubt Allah? How could anyone question the Creator, the one who had given him everything, even his very breath? Yet, as the words of the voice lingered in his mind, Khed felt something stir deep within him, a seed of doubt that had never been planted before. The Quran, the sacred book that had guided his every action and decision, lay before him, its pages turning on their own. With every flip, the text revealed more images, vivid, haunting, and undeniably unsettling. He had always known the Quran to be the absolute truth, a revelation sent from Allah to guide humanity. But now, seeing these images from the past, witnessing the idols that had once surrounded the Kaaba, Khed couldn't help but wonder, had he ever truly understood the full depth of the Quran's message? The images continued to unfold before him, scenes from ancient times, from places far removed from the world Khed knew. He saw people praying to multiple gods, worshipping idols crafted from stone and wood, and offering sacrifices in rituals that seemed both foreign and familiar. The idols surrounding the Kaaba were no longer just relics of a forgotten past, they were a mirror to his own faith, challenging him to confront everything he thought he knew. The voice spoke again, its tone both commanding and compassionate. Khed, have you ever wondered why the Quran was revealed in the way it was? Why it spoke of gods other than Allah? Why it acknowledged the existence of idols? Have you ever questioned why Allah's name was used before the advent of Islam? Each word felt like a dagger to his heart, each question digging deeper into the doubts that now swirled in his mind. The realization hit Khed like a bolt of lightning. He had never questioned his faith. He had never truly pondered the depth of the Quran's teachings, the historical context in which it was revealed, or the reasons behind the verses that mentioned other gods and idols. He had always accepted it at face value, trusting the interpretations passed down through generations. But now, in this surreal moment of reckoning, Khed understood that faith was not just about blind submission, it was about seeking understanding, about asking the difficult questions and striving for deeper insight. As the questions continued to fill his mind, Khed felt a shift within himself. The once steadfast foundation of his beliefs, built on years of devotion and prayer, was now shaking, crumbling under the weight of these profound doubts. He could no longer accept things without question. The words of the voice, "Who is Allah, Khed? Have you ever truly understood who He is?" haunted him, their echoes reverberating through every corner of his consciousness. The Quran's pages began to turn faster, the words blurring together, as if they were trying to tell him something, to reveal a truth he had never seen before. Each page held a mystery, a hidden meaning that Khed had never noticed, never been taught. The voice continued, its power growing, urging him to see beyond the surface, to look deeper into the essence of Allah's message. Khed's mind raced, his heart pounding as he struggled to grasp the enormity of what was unfolding before him. He had spent his entire life devoted to Allah, to the Quran, but now he was faced with the unsettling truth that his understanding had been limited. The journey of faith was not one of simple acceptance, it was a path of inquiry, of seeking truth, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable the answers might be. As the pages of the Quran continued to turn, Khed found himself at a crossroads. The doubts that had taken root in his soul were no longer easily dismissed. He couldn't unsee what he had seen. He couldn't ignore the questions that had been raised. What was the true nature of Allah? What was the true message of the Quran? And most importantly, was he ready to confront the answers, whatever they might be? The voice spoke once more, its tone final and unwavering. Khed, the time has come for you to know the truth. The words echoed through him, a call to awaken from the slumber of unquestioning faith and step into the light of deeper understanding. And as the darkness closed in around him, Khed knew that his journey both in this life and the next had only just begun. Khed felt as though he had been cast adrift on an ocean of uncertainty, with no shore in sight. The questions that had once seemed so distant, so unimportant, now consumed him. After his near-death experience, everything he had known, everything he had devoted his life to, had been thrown into turmoil. The peaceful certainty of his faith had shattered like glass, leaving jagged pieces of doubt scattered across his mind. Who was Allah? What was the true message of the Quran? These questions, once foreign and unsettling, now haunted him at every waking moment. His sense of identity, built on years of religious devotion, had been dismantled, piece by piece, until nothing remained but a void. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. The images he had seen in that surreal place, the idols, the ancient worshippers, the haunting vision of Prophet Muhammad chained and sorrowful, lingered in his thoughts like a nightmare that refused to release its grip. What was he supposed to make of all this? How could he reconcile the faith he had preached with the visions that had shattered his world? How could he return to his community and his role as an Imam when the very foundation of his beliefs had been called into question? Days turned into weeks, and Khed's internal struggle deepened. He became distant from his family and friends, withdrawing into himself as if the weight of the questions threatened to crush him. He no longer found peace in prayer, no longer found comfort in the Quran. The sacred verses that had once spoken to him with clarity now felt distant and indecipherable, like a language he no longer understood. He had tried to return to his daily routines, to perform his duties as an Imam, but it felt like he was merely going through the motions, his heart no longer in it. In his solitude, Khed began to search for answers. He scoured books on philosophy, religion, and history, hoping to find some insight, some explanation that would restore his sense of peace. He spoke with scholars and spiritual leaders, trying to find a voice of reason that could help him navigate the sea of doubt that threatened to drown him. But each conversation only seemed to raise more questions. He found himself asking, had he been deceived all these years? Was the path he had chosen truly the right one? One night, as he sat alone in his study, Khed felt a deep longing in his chest, a yearning for something beyond the confines of his troubled mind. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, but it wasn't a prayer for forgiveness or guidance, it was a prayer for truth. He asked for clarity, for the strength to confront whatever truths lay hidden beneath the layers of his faith. He had to know once and for all whether the life he had built was based on illusion or truth. The silence that followed felt heavy, oppressive. But then, something unexpected happened. It wasn't a voice, but a sense of presence, a feeling that he was no longer alone. Khed opened his eyes and found himself staring at the very same Quran he had once revered, now sitting on his desk like an ancient relic. As his fingers touched the pages, he was flooded with a sense of connection, as though the book itself was calling him to look deeper, to examine not just its words but the very essence of its meaning. Khed realized in that moment that his search for truth was not about finding answers in the books or from others, it was about finding the courage to question everything he had taken for granted. He needed to confront his own fears, his own doubts, and allow himself to see beyond the surface. His crisis of faith was not a punishment, it was a challenge, a test that demanded he seek a deeper understanding to uncover truths hidden within his own soul. As the days passed, Khed felt something inside him begin to shift. The chaos of his mind slowly began to quiet, not because the questions were answered, but because he had started to embrace the uncertainty. He realized that the search for truth was not a linear path, nor was it a destination. It was a journey, a continuous process of seeking, questioning, and growing. His crisis of faith, once a source of pain and confusion, had become a gateway to something greater, a deeper connection to the divine, and a greater understanding of himself. Khed knew that the road ahead would not be easy. He would continue to wrestle with his doubts, with the unsettling visions that had changed his life forever. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. He didn't have all the answers, but perhaps that was okay. The search for truth was not about certainty, it was about the willingness to ask the hard questions, to embrace the unknown, and to trust that, in the end, the answers would come in their own time.